Hi, my name's May. I love yarn. I love to knit and crochet. Those are my hobbies, and I also happen to have been born visually impaired, legally blind, completely colorblind. And so I knit and crochet by feel. And so when I teach or demonstrate things, I try to use my words and describe things so that other people who are visually impaired can follow along. So today's video, we are going to talk about garter stitch in knitting. And I know if you are an experienced knitter, if you really have even, a little bit of experience in knitting, you probably already know pretty much everything that we're going to talk about in this video. It's just a discussion on garter stitch. As well as a demonstration of how it's done, where we use it, and that kind of a thing. But I have a variety of topics at a variety of different levels and teachings on my channel. And so I like to make sure that I have things for beginners as well as, people who like to design. If you're a returning viewer to my channel, I love to just kind of, make up my own patterns and designs and create in the moment, right, on the fly. But I also like to have things for beginners because I know that when I was first learning to knit, it was a struggle for me to sometimes find things that could explain things in a way to me that I could follow and understand on the internet. So when you first learn to knit, the first thing that you're going to need to do, of course, is learn how to cast on your stitches, right? You got to get stitches on the needle. Now, this is not a very beginning lesson on how to cast on, okay? I've already got stitches on my needle. But the first thing that you're probably going to learn once you have stitches on the needle, and casting on can be, more complicated and challenging to learn than the actual process of knitting, right? The knit stitch. I know for me it was a struggle. I actually had tried to cast on, struggled with it when I first learned how to knit. And finally, my friend who was teaching me cast on the stitches, worked a couple rows, and then gave me the project after she showed me how to knit. And that's as far as we got. And then, of course, she did teach me how to cast on. And then I moved before she had a chance to teach me how to even purl or bind off. So then I had to learn those things on my own, and it was certainly challenging. So once you have stitches on your needle, you're going to be doing the knit stitch, and most likely you won't be learning to purl right away. Now you might. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. In my opinion, I would just focus. But you do you. We're all different. Some people may want to knit and purl, learn how to knit and purl at the same time. I didn't. I didn't learn how to purl for more than a year after I learned how to knit. And so, my experience, in my opinion, is just focus on the knit stitch, learn the mechanics, and sort of build it into your muscle memory. Focus on your tension, keeping your tension straight, right, consistency in your tension, as well as maintaining your stitch count in your project. Now, I often recommend to people, that their first project be something simple like a dishcloth. But again, of course, you can do whatever you want, right? I just, if you want to make your very first project a blanket, by all means, do a blanket. But, for me, I just wanted something small that was manageable, that I could finish, that was a practical piece. And so this is not my first dishcloth. I don't even know what happened to my first dishcloth, but this is an example of a cotton knit dishcloth, knit in the Premier Yarns Home Cotton in the Americana way, the red, white, and blue. And this dishcloth is completely knit, every single stitch. And so when you're knitting flat, that's one of the first things you need to learn too about knitting, is that you can knit flat or you can knit in the round, and it's done differently depending on what you're doing. So I have this blue sweater that we're working with that's on the needles. We're going to be working with this today. And I am knitting it top down from the collar down. So we're at the bottom of it. And I have a long circular needle on it. And because it's a cardigan, it's going to be open in the front. It's going to have buttons, which means it's not, it's worked in one piece, but it's not knit in the round because we want an opening in the front. And so we're knitting it flat, which means we start at one end, right? We start at the one end where our yarn is, and then we will knit all the way across it to the last stitch on the needle. And that will be where our yarn ends up. So when we work that last stitch, then that's where our yarn will be. And so then, because we'll be knitting flat, we're going to pick up our project and flip it all the way over so that the last stitch that we worked becomes the first stitch that you work. And that's what happens when you're knitting flat versus knitting in the round. On the same project, I've already done most of one of the sleeves. Okay, we're going to turn it back over. It was upside down so we could see the bottom, the hem there. So this is it from the top. This is the neckline of the cardie. We got the sleeves. We're doing some raglan sleeves. So I've done most of one sleeve here. I also have it on 2 circular needles. And this is going to be knit in the round because we don't want an opening, right? We don't want an opening there. So it's a sleeve. We don't need buttons on the down the side. We want it completely in one piece. And so I am using 2 circular needles. I do have the little holders on the end so my stitches don't come off, but with a circular, now you can do knitting in the round on 2 circulars. You could do it on 1 circular, probably not on a sleeve this small, on a baby sweater, or you can do it on double pointed needles on 3 or 4 double pointed needles. I just prefer circulars. So when you're knitting in the round, you'll have your yarn on the back on 2 circulars on the back needle. And then when you start, you will start and you'll work across the front needle, all the way across every stitch on the front needle, all the way to the last stitch on your front needle. And then you flip your project over, and then you start working on your back needle on the back side of the sleeve. And so you work all the way across, whether it's knitting or purling or cabling or whatever your pattern is, you work all the way across that sleeve, that needle, to the end of the sleeve. And then that will be the end of the round. So both sides of the sleeve on both of these circular needles is just one round, okay? So that would be a round. And so then when you get to the end of that round, where your yarn will be at, that's where my yarn is at now. My yarn is on the back needle at the end of a round. And so when I start that next round, I will flip the project back over and start the next round on the front side of the sleeve, so that our first stitch that we work at the beginning of the next round is the first stitch that we worked from previous rounds. So it's different than knitting flat. When you're knitting in the round, your first stitch is always going to be the same stitch, versus when you're working flat, like on the hem, you go back and forth from side to side. So when I finish a row, right, it's really important to understand if your pattern's being worked in rows or in rounds. So versus when you're knitting flat in rows, when you get to the end of your row and you flip your project, the first stitch in the next row is going to be the last stitch of your previous row. And so you'll be working on the what's called the wrong side, or the inside of your project. So on the outside of this sweater, we see what's called stockinette stitch, which is what most people understand. That's what most people see knitting as, stockinette stitch. So on the inside, what's considered the wrong side, we're seeing reverse stockinette. Now, it's not wrong to have reverse stockinette on the outside. So there's definitely some projects that have reverse stockinette on the outside. That's just how it's referred to in your projects. And it'll tell you, it'll say RS for right side and WS for wrong side in your pattern. And that will help you understand and keep straight which rows you're on or which rounds that you're on. And so because of that, the stitches appear differently depending on whether they're worked in rows or in rounds, okay? So for this garter stitch dishcloth, I started at the bottom and it's worked in rows, right? It's not a circle. So we start at one end, we knit all the way across it, we got to the other end, and the last stitch of the on that row, we flip it over, and the last stitch becomes the first stitch on the second row, okay? And so when you knit every single stitch flat, you get garter stitch, versus when you knit it in the round. You need to know, so this is garter stitch at the hem of this sweater. So it's knit every single stitch, and then you flip it over, and then you knit every single stitch. You don't purl to get garter stitch. When you do stockinette stitch, you knit a row, and then you purl a row. Because of the nature of garter stitch and knitting in the round versus knitting flat, when you do garter stitch in the round, to get the same appearance, right? When you start and you knit one row, then when you go to your second row, to do garter stitch in the round, you have to purl it. And it is very confusing. When you're a beginner knitter, it's very, very confusing to try to understand, like, why is it different? And it's because in the round, your first stitch is always your first stitch, and you're always looking at the sort of the outside of the project, versus you're flipping your project back and forth, and you're going so that your last stitch becomes the first stitch on the next row. So you can do anything you want in garter stitch, right? If you want, I like to do a dishcloth for your first project, because you can definitely, this is a multicolored yarn, you can certainly knit every single stitch in a dishcloth. It's going to look fine, right? It's a perfectly functional dishcloth in garter stitch. And what I like to tell people, whether it's knitting or crochet, the great thing about doing a dishcloth is it's going to be a practical and functional item, and it doesn't matter if your stitch count gets a little off, right? If you lose a stitch here or there, or you accidentally increase a stitch, because I struggled with, when I first learned how to knit and crochet, with maintaining my stitch counts. And so my first dishcloths, both knitting and crochet, are really wonky looking. The edges are not straight at all. And so that's the only reason I recommend that for people, is because it really doesn't matter if it's not perfect. It doesn't matter if there's mistakes, and it is still a functional item. It's also a quick project. You can get it on and off the needles. You can get it finished. You get that sense of satisfaction that, yes, I knit my first item, my first object, right? But of course, you can do whatever you want. If you, like, I know kids aren't necessarily, like, if you're trying to teach your child or your teenager how to knit or crochet, they're not necessarily excited about doing a dishcloth, right? They're not real thrilled about that. So, they may be way more interested in knitting a scarf or something, right? Or, blanket, but that could take months. I mean, you can knit, your first project can be a blanket if you want, but it could take months. And some people do get frustrated and impatient wanting to sort of get their first project done. So, the other thing I want to talk about with garter stitch is how and why we use it. Now, this little blue sweater, here's two different blue sweaters. We have a completed blue sweater that's got cables and buttons on. If you're a returning viewer to my channel, you'll recognize this. This is Mr. Bear's sweater, right? This is Mr. Bear's sweater. And I designed this myself, right? It's top down, the same design. The one on the needles, I did not design myself. It's somebody else's design. It's very similar to mine, but it's going to have a new feature in it that I'm not very good at, that I'm trying to learn, right? So I'm using somebody else's pattern for that. But I did design Mr. Bear's sweater. And so I started with garter stitch at the top, right? So this is what we have. We have 4 rows, and this sweater it's knit in the Valley Yarns Haydenville DK. So I knit, after my cast done, I knit 4 rows where I just knit every single stitch of every single row. And why we do that on collars is because it's just the nature of knitting. If you don't, knitting stockinette stitch on the edge, it curls in on itself. And you can see I did that on the button band too. When I designed Mr. Bear's sweater, I included the button band in on my stitch count where the buttons and the buttonholes are, and those are also done in garter stitch. So we have a nice edge, right, on the sweater for the buttons. It lays nice and flat. If you don't do that, the current sweater that I'm working on does not start. It's somebody else's pattern and does not start with garter stitch on the top. It just starts immediately in stockinette stitch. So this is a great example of what your project will look like. If you do not start your project in garter stitch, but you start it in stockinette, this is what your project will look like. It will curl on itself. Now you can start projects in other types of stitches, right? Like at the bottom of Mr. Bear's sweater is some ribbing. So you could start your project with ribbing and then it would lay flat. There are some lace patterns that will lay flat on their own, but stockinette will not lay flat on its own if you start it. So that's just something to be aware of, why projects are going to start with like ribbing or garter stitch or something. So this is the neckline of his sweater, and that's why it's curling in on itself, because there's no garter stitch, there's no ribbing. So if you don't do garter stitch, your neckline will curl. And it's the same thing for the sides here. This pattern does not have any kind of garter stitch band or rib band or anything on it, so it's curling in on itself. Okay, so let's talk about and do a little garter stitch knitting. So just in case you're like totally brand new to everything in knitting, which is what I want to put out there. I want to have some really basic stuff out on my channel. I want to have stuff for everybody at every level of knitting and crochet. So, well, I can't say every. There's skills that I don't have, but skills that I have. There's way more in knitting and crochet that I still need to learn too. So I am by no means the expert on all. Okay, so let's zoom that back in. So with this particular pattern, we slip the first stitch, which means you don't work it. You just slide it from the left-hand needle to the right-hand needle. And then after that, we're going to knit every single stitch, okay? And this is how you knit garter stitch flat. When you're making a hem, like on this little sweater that I have on my needles, and you're working it flat, you go down the entire row. So if you are starting or ending your sweater or your cuffs or whatever it is that you're doing, you're just going to knit every single stitch, okay? That's it. You go down the row, you knit every stitch. Okay, so I'm going to pause the camera, right? Because you don't need that. I forget how many stitches we have here, but it's something like, 68 or something like that. So you don't need to watch me knit 68 stitches. So I am going to pause the camera. I'm going to finish knitting this row. I will see ya at the end of the row, and we'll work the next row, and we'll look at how garter stitch is knit. Okay, so I will pause the camera. I'll work to the end, but this is how you knit garter stitch when you're knitting flat. You knit every single stitch. Okay, so I am working. I'm almost to the end of this row, which by the way is not, I have 4 rows of garter stitch already, so I'm working on the 5th, and you can tell from the appearance as well as the texture. Stockinette stitch is much more flat. Garter stitch creates ridges, okay, and so that's how you can easily feel it and distinguish it from stockinette. So okay, I'm coming up to my last stitch on the row, and I'm going to knit it. And now, because we're working flat, we're just going to pick up our project and flip it over. So the very last stitch that I worked is now going to become my first stitch on this next row. And we are going, because we're knitting in garter stitch, and this pattern has me slip, so I'm going to slip, which means not work the first stitch, and then all the rest of my stitches are going to be knit. So this is all that you do when you're working in garter stitch, is knit every single stitch all the way across. Whether it's sleeves or hems, or maybe you're creating little ridges within your pattern, whatever, but it definitely changes the texture, right? It goes from a much more flat texture to creating a tactile ridge in your work that you can feel. And it's also a shorter stitch than the knit stitch and stockinette stitch. is a little bit of a taller stitch. Garter stitch stitches are a little bit squatter. They don't quite have the height. So that does change. It can change your row gauge when you're working on a pattern just a little bit in terms of how many rows you'll get per inch. So that's just something to keep in mind. I don't think that it depends on the pattern. Sometimes it can make a significant change, sometimes it doesn't. So, but it's just something to keep in mind. So I'm going to go ahead and pause the camera and work to the end of this row, and then we'll flip it over and we'll look at it again, and we'll look at our work and the next garter ridge that we just completed. But this is just a demo of how, a little discussion on garter stitch, what it looks like when we don't use it, why we use it, what it's going to create in our project, what it's going to feel like, what it's going to look like. And this is how you do it when you're working flat in rows. You knit every single stitch of every row. Okay, pause the camera till I get to the end. Okay, so I am approaching the end of my second row in garter stitch, and I am knitting every single stitch. We're going to knit this last stitch, and then we are going to flip our project over, and we'll take a look at what we have. We have now created a third garter ridge on the hem of our sweater. So there's a clear visual difference and there's a clear tactile difference in the pattern. It's a shorter stitch and it has got more depth to it. It's taller in terms of it's shorter than the stockinette stitch, but it's raised up. That's what I'm trying to say, so that it creates a little ridge or a texture on there. Okay, and so you can do that on hems, and then you can also do it like on blankets. You've seen it on my channel. This pink blanket, most people do it for borders on blankets. And that's so that the edge of your border, your blanket, will lay nice and flat. So we do garter stitch borders on the bottom and on the top and on the sides. We work that in. So mine's got 3 garter stitches on each side of the blanket and 4 rows of garter stitch on the bottom and top. And then also in this particular blanket, if you followed along on the tutorial, this is what garter stitch ridges look like when they're worked into projects. So you can use them just for decorative purposes, right? Just to add a little texture to your pattern. This is the feather and fan lace blanket, and we work the stockinette, first 2 rows in stockinette, knit and purl. Then we work a lace row and knit. Then we work a purl row, and rows 5 and 6 of the repeat are knit and knit 2 in a row. So that creates your garter stitch ridge. It gives the project some texture. So you can absolutely incorporate garter stitch into patterns, not just on edges, but into patterns to give them texture and sort of decorative purposes. Okay, so these are interchangeable needles. Now I'm at the bottom of this and I need to bind off, but I'm not going to do that right now. I'm just going to pause the camera. These are interchangeable needles, and we're going to go ahead and take these needle tips off. We're going to put the holders on the edge, and we'll go and work that sleeve so that you can see what garter stitch in the round looks like. Be right back. Okay, I've taken the holders off the edges of my needles, the ends of my needles on the sleeve, and now you can see that the sleeve is worked in stockinette and it's all flat all the way up to the edge. There is no garter stitch edging on this sleeve yet. So I've got my needle tips on the 2 different circulars. So now we're going to knit garter stitch in the round. So I've got 2 circular needles, and in my front needle, we're just going to knit every single stitch on my front needle. Okay, so I think I've got 18 stitches on the front needle, and 18, we can call that needle 1, and 18 stitches on my back needle, which we can call needle 2. And we'll call this our first round of garter stitch. Okay, we've already worked, I don't know what, probably 30 rounds in stockinette, which is the round is knit every round. So it's super confusing. So in your first round of garter stitch, when you're working in the round, you're just gonna knit every single stitch. And I'll just work, I'm almost to the end of these 18 stitches, so I'm just going to work these with you, and we'll get to, but so this is we'll call it our first round of garter stitch on our sleeve. But just because we get to the end of needle 1 here, it doesn't mean that we're at the end of the row. When we flip it over and we work on needle 2, or if you were working on 3 or 4 double points, okay, that's still the same round. So we flip it over and we're on our back needle or needle 2, but we're still on the same round. And so we are going to continue to knit every single stitch. Okay, this is 18 more stitches, so I'm going to pause the camera. You don't need to watch that. Okay, I am coming up to the end here. I've got just a couple stitches left on this round. It's still round 1 of our garter stitch edging. So once again, we're going to flip it over, and now we're going to start round 2 of our garter stitches. So far there's no difference, right? We did that row of still knitting, no difference. So we're going to start round 2 now of our garter stitch cuff on our sleeve. So to do that, because we're knitting in the round, our first stitch of the next row is still it's the same as the first stitch on the previous row. So to get that ridge, to change the difference, we actually have to reverse the garter stitch and we have to purl. So when you're working in the round, you move that yarn to the front of the work and you start purling. And so this is how you create, it's super confusing. When you first learn how to knit and then you realize that you have to reverse things back and forth from knitting flat to knitting in the round. And then when you start designing like I do, and you realize that your cables and your lace and everything, if you want to take a flat pattern and work it in a skirt or a top in the round, you got to flip the whole thing around to get those wrong side rows. So we are going to purl every single stitch. Round 2 in garter stitch in the round is purled. Every single stitch to create the same effect as you would knitting flat. Instead of knitting every single stitch in every row, you knit in garter stitch, you knit the first round, and then you purl the second round. So I think I'm almost to the end of this round 2 of the first half of my sleeve here. Little baby sweater here. Baby garments are great for learning new skills. And garter stitch is not the new skill for me. There's a button band I'm going to work on. So you can already tell with just this second round how it changes the texture, how we're getting our garter stitch ridge immediately pops up by purling. And so we're creating a garter stitch ridge even though we're purling because we're working in the round. So I'm going to go ahead and flip this over. We're still on round 2 of garter stitch because we're not finished with the second half. We still have to do needle 2 on our sleeve. So here we go. I'm just going to start this with you. So to purl, remember, we have to bring the yarn to the front of the work. And to bring your yarn to the front of the work, and then you purl that stitch. So you work it from the front. Okay, I'm just going to purl a couple of these stitches with you. I am visually impaired, so I definitely knit differently than sighted people. I throw continental. Most people who knit continental pick. So you might look at how I knit and purl and think, that's different. I've never seen that before, and that's okay. You don't have to knit like me. You can pick if you can do it. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and pause the camera. I'm going to finish this round, right, where we're purling. So garter stitch in the round, you knit 1 round, you purl 1 round. Okay, I'll be right back and we'll do it one more time. Okay, so I am coming up to the end of round 2 worked in garter stitch. And you can tell if you're sighted. I'm going to go ahead and show you one more time. So I'm at the end of round 2 because I've knit needle 2. So we're going to flip it over now, and we are going to start needle round 3, right? Round 3 of garter stitch on our sleeve. And this is needle 1. We're back to the beginning of round number 3. So let me get this started again. So for round number 3, garter stitch, you knit just like round 1, right? Your odd numbered ones are going to be the same. So we are going to knit every single stitch. We're just knit it. That's what you do. So if it's your odd numbered rows that you knit, then you'll knit all the odd numbered rows, and then you'll purl your even numbered rows, or whatever your pattern says, or your even rounds, excuse me. Want to make sure we keep our rounds and our rows distinct here, right? Rows are knit and worked flat. Rounds are worked in the round, like for sleeves and skirts, sweaters, etc. One thing that you'll notice that I try to do when I'm working in the round is use different textures of needles for my needle 1 and needle 2 because I'm visually impaired and I work by feel. It just really helps me to keep straight which needle I'm working on. So needle 1 for me is a nickel plated needle. And needle 2 for me is a carbon fiber needle, which I love. So, but I also got wooden needles and bamboo needles, and so it's not too hard for me to come up with needles of different. So we're turning it over, and we're going to work on round 3 of our sleeve on needle 2. So sometimes that's what I'll do. I've got needles of a variety of textures. So that's one way that I help myself to distinguish needle 1 from needle 2. So here we go. Still on round 3 on needle 2. We are going to knit every single stitch all the way across. So this is the carbon fiber needle. I can definitely feel the difference in the nickel versus the carbon fiber. Another thing that I'll do, sometimes I will work on 2 nickel needles because I have a lot of those. And sometimes I just have like the one set with me, is sometimes then I'll just use a different length of a cable. So like on my socks, I might work on 2 nickel plated needles, but I'll try to use different lengths. So I might use a shorter cable cord for the front needle, and then I'll use a longer cable for the back needle on my sock so that I can make sure I can accommodate my increases for my heels. So, but there's lots of different tips and tricks that I use with knitting in the round and knitting in general that I do to help myself tactily to keep straight, right? Which round I'm on, which side of the round that I'm on, which side of the project it's on. So we're almost done here with round number 3 of our, I think we've got just a few stitches left here. Round number 3 of our sleeve in garter stitch, where we knit every single stitch. We're going to turn it over. And once again, you can see what we're creating because we've got a knit and we haven't done the purl row yet. It's already wanting to go back to creating stockinette. Right? You can feel it and you can see it. So now to continue to create those garter stitch ridges to make the project lay flat, right? Unlike the collar on this sweater, right? How it's curling in on itself because there's no garter stitch, there's no ribbing on that. So if we didn't put garter stitch on the hem of this sweater and the sleeves, they would curl just like the neckline is right now. So to do round 4 and the garter stitch, just like we did with round 2 on needle 1, here we go. We are going to bring our yarn to the front of our project, and we are going to purl every single stitch. Here we go. Purling our way across our project. Okay. So basically that's it. I'm going to go ahead and finish this purl row off camera. Okay, you don't need to see me purl the whole row, and then probably I'll go ahead and work 2 more rounds in garter stitch, just so you can see what it looks like, get a better visual of it. Well, I can show you the end of this round 4, and then I'll do 2 more rounds so that you can get a visual of it. But that's pretty much the difference in garter stitch, knit flat versus knit in the round. When you knit garter stitch flat, you knit every single stitch of every single row. And when you're doing what I'm doing, where you knit garter stitch in the round, then you alternate. You knit one round and then you purl the next round. Okay, so you just alternate back and forth to create your garter stitch ridge. So I'm going to go ahead and purl the second half of this, and then I'll let you see it. So this is the end of round number 4 on the sleeve in garter stitch. You can see now that we have 2 garter ridges. So it takes the 2 rounds, the knit round and then the purl round, to create 1 garter ridge. So this is round 1 and 2 that create the garter ridge. Round 3 and 4 have created our garter ridge. I'm going to go ahead and work 2 more rounds, show you that, and that will conclude the video. Be right back. Okay, so I have just completed 6 rounds of garter stitch on my cuff. That is enough. 6 rounds, 3 ridges will definitely make this little cuff sleeve lay flat, and that way it won't curl up on itself like the collar on this sweater and the side of it. So that's it. That's garter stitch in the round. Is you get 3 ridges for 6 rounds. So you knit 1 round, you purl 1 round, knit 1 round, purl 1 round. So you alternate 6 rounds, 3 ridges. I did the same thing on the bottom, except we worked flat and we worked in rows. This is 6 rows of garter stitch where you knit every single stitch, and then 6 rows makes 3 ridges. So it takes 2 rows of garter stitch to create the ridge. Okay, well, I hope that this is helpful for new beginners who are just getting into knitting, or maybe you're just thinking about getting into knitting. I think this is some good basics that I would have liked to have, had a good demonstration and lesson on. So anyways, thank you so much for listening. Feel free to ask questions in the comment section. And until next time, happy stitching. Bye-bye for now.